Good morning. It's so great to see people here today. As you know, we're doing 2 Sundays where the focus of our service is our excerpts from the book Braiding, Sweetgrass, which will be explored in greater depth on February 7th in a program at the library. And many people I've had conversations with have said, oh, this part of it, that part of it, this part of it. You know, it's had this kind of profound influence, but it's the kind of book that people, the publisher says, people tend to get a copy and then buy 2 more to give to 2 other people. And it has so much richness in it that, you know, once is not enough. So the long-term ideas in it are a couple of things that we'll pull out a couple of them to look at in the next 2 Sundays. And I encourage you to take part in the February 7th discussion too, which will be led by Laura Ogden, who's an anthropologist with a specialty in fields that overlap with a lot of the learning in this book. So before we get started, I'd just like to ask us to take a moment to bring ourselves to this time and space and prepare ourselves for whatever we might derive from this time together. We have moved on to welcome and announcements. And first I want to say we're welcoming Carol Rousseau back. We're so happy to see her back from Barnard. Yay! And we're going to be seeing her regularly here at the sanctuary, so great. I know Jim has a couple of announcements that he wants to make. So I'll call on you first, Jim. And you want to come up here and grab this little microphone? Make those announcements, and then...
Yes, so 2 announcements. Anamika has needed to postpone her concert this afternoon. And she's done a pretty good job, I think, of letting people know, but it's in the bulletin today that it will be. But new hopes will come later. And then secondly, Joys and Concerns will follow my reading from Braiding Sweetgrass. It's not in the sequence, but that's where you'll know it will be.
Seems like there's a little bit of an audio issue with the microphone. Maybe it's a little too hot. Yes? You have an announcement? You want to come up here and make it? Just so we don't have that feedback. Thank you, Jeanette. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you to everybody who donated to the White Basket in the back.
It's listed in the bulletin, but I just wanted to personally thank you for all the food and the big pack of diapers that we took over to the Sharon Food Shelf this week. With the cost of food high right now, the food shelf is being used a lot. People were so happy this week and thankful for eggs. And so please keep continuing. Just one little item makes such a difference. It really piles up in a month. So thank you, thank you. Also, welcome to the parish hall after the service for a cookie and some juice and just to gather and talk. Thank you.
And do you want to say anything about Eloise next week? Oh yeah, that'd be great.
It's on the schedule for Eloise Ginty to come and speak. Bless you. We have, as a church, we have supported her organization, Hearts You Hold. And we have asked her to come do a mission moment and just tell us about this organization. Eloise is near and dear to many of our hearts. She was a Newton school teacher for a long time, beloved. And this is one of her new passions. So we're hoping that she'll be here next Sunday. I'm going to check in with her this week and see if she can still come. So that's something wonderful to look forward to. Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you, Danette. That's great.
Good morning. Today we have the privilege of a responsive reading, a poem called The Eagle Poem by Joy Harjo. I hope that's how you say her name. And it continues a little bit on the back of your bulletin. So, to pray you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon.
To one whole voice that is you.
And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear.
Can't know except in moments steadily growing, and languages that are always sound, but other circles of motion.
Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky, in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings.
We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take utmost care and kindness in all things.
Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion. We pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. Now join us as we sing hymn number 719 in the Methodist hymnal.
we don't see children, at least by age, in the pews today. And but I think one of the things that children are aware of, and we're all aware of through our whole life, is that there are different ways to know things. And many, many different ways. And two different ways are sort of scientifically and through things that you've learned kind of in your own tradition. And one of the things we're going to be looking at as we look at braiding sweetgrass is how those two kinds of ways of knowing help each other to grow and help us to grow in our embrace of the world and our who we are in the world. And that's one of the, Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose book we're going to be reading from, looks at the world through the eyes of a botanist, and also through her own tradition, her Native American tradition, the learning that has come through that. And she found that, the Society of Botanists she joined believed that it could not be possibly wrong, that there were actually great blinders on the vision of the people that she found herself among. They had they were bringing a certain mindset to the world that needed to be expanded, and so you see that interplay as well in her writing. So that is what I hope we can kind of give some room for. And let's close with reading together the new version of the Lord's Prayer, which I'm going to just grab a copy of. The bottom half of the back side of the little piece of paper that's in your pew. Read it together. Here we go. Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, way, truth, and life, force of love and light flowing within and all around us. May your realm of compassion, justice, and peace rule our world. Thank you for nurturing and guiding us, forgiving us and helping us forgive, and leading us away from harmful desires. Please save us from all forms of evil, for you are our source, our home, our power, all goodness and beauty forever. Amen. There is a darkness in these hills, I am not afraid. There is a darkness in these hills, I am not afraid. There is a darkness in these hills, though some may tremble, I am still, but I say, hope is in these quiet hills. There is a darkness in the land, I see the taste of hope. There is a darkness in the land, I see the taste of hope. There is a darkness in the land, with more
Bible passage today is from the letter of Paul to the Corinthians, the first letter, verses 10 through 13. Now, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you should be in agreement, and that there should be no divisions among you, but that you should be united in the same mind and the same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? Here ends the reading.
I'm sure you've all heard this joke, but I love it so much I have to say it again. Becky's name for these Sundays when Tom is not here are unpasteurized services. And we're a family who loves puns, so no apologies. I wanted to mention, as a sort of a transition, the reading we did together, the responsive reading. I want to just make sure everyone knows that Joy Harjo is presently our National Poet Laureate. And there's a nice little chime or coincidence in that Amber and Vin this morning saw a hawk, who's of course the cousin of the eagle that she's describing. And also there's a link to what I'm going to read to you. In this poem, Joy Harjo says, "And know there's more that you can't see, can't hear." And then we responded and sang, "Can't know except in moments steadily growing, and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion." So, as Becky mentioned, Robin Wall Kimmerer is a botanist and really esteemed in her field as a scientist. She's also, her lineage is Potawatomi, which is a native people now based in Oklahoma, but they were moved there. There was a period of time, and people know about the Trail of Tears, but there was a decision to make what they called Indian country, and they moved people from other parts of the country and put them there. So that's not her original people's land, but it has become home. Now she teaches at SUNY in Syracuse. So part of the book is about coming to know another place, another part of the country, but she continues to visit home, the land of her grandparents, which is in the Midwest. I also, before I start reading, I want to acknowledge John Freitag first told me about this book. And it is a book, like Becky said, that people tend to tell each other about. It's very easy to read in parts. It's made of chapters that are really self-contained essays. So if you like what you hear, you might find yourself dipping into it or reading the whole thing. Becky and I, as we began, we decided we would read the book aloud together. So for about a year, in the first year of the pandemic, we were reading this aloud. So I'm going to start with the very beginning of the book, and it starts with an origin story, which it plunges you right into a different way of thinking about the very beginnings of the world. And then we'll make a transition, and you'll see Robin Kimmerer in the role of a teacher in a science class, but also part of the quest of this book is finding a way to reconcile these two different kinds of expertise and sensibility. So there's a little piece of a folk tale, we would call it, but it really is, it's as important, as the Adam and Eve story. In winter, when the green earth lies resting beneath a blanket of snow, this is the time for storytelling. The storytellers begin by calling upon those who came before, who passed the stories down to us, for we are only messengers. In the beginning, there was the sky world. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below. But in the emptiness, there were many eyes gazing up at the sudden shaft of light. They saw there was a small object, a mere dust mote in the beam. As it grew closer, they could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled toward them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. Far from the only home she'd ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward. And so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather: loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water and agreed to go find some. Loon dove first, but the distance was too far, and after a long while he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help: otter, beaver, sturgeon. But the depth, the darkness, and the pressures were too great for even the strongest of swimmers. They returned, gasping for air, with their hands wringing. Some did not return at all. Soon, only little Muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He volunteered to go, while the others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone a very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative, and before long a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of the muskrat. He had given his life to aid this helpless human. And then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back, and I will hold it." Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, from the dab of mud on Turtle's back until the whole earth was made. Not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all the animals' gifts, coupled with her deep gratitude. Together they formed what we know today as Turtle Island, our home. I realized that would have been a very nice reading for children's time. So now she makes a transition. You'll see her in her other role as a teacher and as a scientist. I have Bruce King's portrait of Sky Woman, Moment in Flight, hanging in my lab. Floating to earth with her handful of seeds and flowers, she looks down on my microscopes and data loggers. It might seem an odd juxtaposition, but to me she belongs there. As a writer, a scientist, and a carrier of Sky Woman's story, I sit at the feet of my elder teachers, listening for their songs. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 9:35 a.m., I am usually in a lecture hall at the university, expounding about botany and ecology, trying, in short, to explain to my students how Sky Woman's gardens, known by some as global ecosystems, function. One otherwise unremarkable morning, I gave the students in my general ecology class a survey. Among other things, they were asked to rate their understanding of the negative interactions between humans and the environment. Nearly every one of the 200 students said confidently that humans and nature are a bad mix. I'm going to read that again because this is astonishing. Nearly every one of the 200 students said confidently that humans and nature are a bad mix. These were third-year students who had selected a career in environmental protection, so the response was, in a way, not very surprising. They were well-schooled in the mechanics of climate change, toxins in the land and water, and the crisis of habitat loss. Later in the survey, they were asked to rate their knowledge of positive interactions between people and land. The median response was none. I was stunned. How is it possible that in 20 years of education, they cannot think of any beneficial relationships between people and the environment? Perhaps the negative examples they see every day, brownfields, factory farms, suburban sprawl, truncated their ability to see some good between humans and the earth. As the land becomes impoverished, so too does the scope of their vision. When we talked about this after class, I realized that they could not even imagine what beneficial relations between their species and others might look like. How can we begin to move toward ecological and cultural sustainability if we cannot even imagine what the path feels like, if we can't imagine the generosity of geese? These students were not raised on the story of Sky Woman. So now I'm going to make a transition to a field trip. And she sets this up pretty clearly so you'll understand. This is, again, the scientist taking a group of students into the woods. I'd never wanted to live in the South, but when my husband's job took us there, I duly learned the flora and tried to cultivate affection for the drab oaks when I longed for fiery maples. Even if I did not feel fully at home, the least I could do was to help my students develop a sense of botanical belonging. In pursuit of this humble goal, I had taken my pre-med students to a local nature reserve where the forest marched up the slope in bands of color signifying ribbons of different species from the floodplain to the ridge. I asked them to invent a hypothesis or two to explain why this striking pattern existed. "It's all part of God's plan," said one student. "You know, the grand design." After 10 years of immersion in the primacy of materialist science as the explanation for the function of the world, I had to swallow hard. Where I'm from, an answer like that would have drawn laughter or at least rolled eyes. But in this group, it simply yielded nods of assent, or at the least tolerance. "That's an important perspective," I said carefully, "but scientists have different explanations for the distribution of vegetation over the landscape, maples in one place and spruce in another." This was a dance I was trying to get used to, teaching in the Bible Belt. I stumbled over 2 very left feet. Have you ever wondered how the world got to be put together so beautifully? Why certain plants grow here and not there? Judging by their polite blankness, this was not a burning question for them. Their total disinterest in ecology pained me. To me, ecological insight was the music of the spheres. But to them, it was just one more requirement in their pre-med education. A biological story that wasn't about humans was of little interest. I didn't understand how one could be a biologist without being able to see the land, to know the natural history and the elegant flow of natural forces. The earth is so richly endowed that the least we can do in return is to pay attention. And so, with a little evangelical fervor of my own, I set my sights on the conversion of their scientific souls. All eyes were on me, waiting for failure, so I paid attention to every little detail, just to prove them wrong. Vans idled in the circle in front of the administration building while I checked my list one more time. Maps prepared, campsites reserved, 18 pairs of binoculars, 6 field microscopes, 3 days of food, first aid kits, and reams of handouts of graphs and scientific names. The dean argued that it was too expensive to take students into the field. I argued that it was too costly not to. Whether the passengers were willing or not, our little convoy of college vans was headed down the highway through the sheared-off mountaintops of coal country, where the streams run red with acid. Shouldn't students devoted to a profession in health see this firsthand? The hours on a dark highway gave me plenty of time to consider the wisdom of trying the dean's patience in my very first job. The college was already struggling with finances, and I was just a part-time instructor, teaching a few classes while I finished my dissertation. I'd left my baby girls at home with their dad in order to introduce other people's children to something they cared little about. This exclusive little college had built its reputation in the South on the successful admission of its students to medical school. Accordingly, the sons and daughters of the bluegrass aristocracy were sent here for their first stop toward lives of privilege. In keeping with this medical mission, the dean ritually donned a white coat every morning as a priest dons his vestments. His desk calendar called only for administrative meetings, budget reviews, and alumni functions, but the lab coat was a fixture. Though I never saw him in an actual lab, it was no wonder that he harbored doubts about a flannel-shirted scientist like me. The biologist Paul Ehrlich called ecology the subversive science for its power to cause us to reconsider the place of humans in the natural world. So far, these students had devoted several years to the study of a single species, themselves. I had a whole 3 days to be subversive, to distract them from Homo sapiens for a glimpse of the 6 million other species with whom we share the planet. The dean voiced his concerns about funding, quote, a mere camping trip. But I argued that the Great Smoky Mountains were a major reservoir of biodiversity and promised that it would be a legitimate scientific expedition. I was tempted to add that we'd wear lab coats for good measure. He sighed and signed the requisition. The composer Aaron Copland got it right. An Appalachian spring is music for dancing. The woods dance with the colors of wildflowers, nodding sprays of white dogwood, and the pink froth of redbuds, rushing streams and the embroidered solemnity of dark mountains. But we were here to work. I got out of my tent the first morning with clipboard in hand and lessons in mind. The range spread out above us in our valley campsite. The Smokies in early spring are a patchwork of diffuse colors, like a map with individual nations colored. Pale green for the newly leafed poplars, gray blocks of the still dormant oaks, and dusty rose for the maples breaking bud. Here and there, hot pink tracts of redbud and swaths of white reveal where the dogwoods bloom, and lines of dark green hemlock trace the watercourses like a cartographer's pen. Back in the classroom, hands white with chalk dust, I had diagrammed the gradients of temperature, soils, and growing season. Before us, the mountainside spread the pastel map of our field trip, the abstract translated into flowers. Moving up the mountainside was the ecological equivalent of walking to Canada. The warm valley floor could give us a Georgia summer, while the 5,000-foot summits are akin to Toronto. Bring your warm jackets, I told them. An increase of 1,000 feet is equivalent to moving 100 miles northward, and therefore many steps back into spring. The dogwoods on the lower slopes were in full bloom, creamy white sprays against the emerging leaves. Moving upslope, they reversed like a time-lapse camera running backward from open blossoms to tightly bound buds not yet awakened by heat. Midway up the slopes, where the growing season is too short, the dogwoods disappear altogether, their place taken by another tree more tolerant of the late season frosts, Silverbells. For 3 days, we wandered over this ecological map, traversing elevational zones from deep cove forests of tulip poplar and cucumber magnolia to the summits. The lush coves were a garden of wildflowers, glossy patches of wild ginger, and 9 species of trillium. The students dutifully wrote down whatever I told them, creating a mirror image of my internal checklist of things to see without much apparent interest. They asked for the spelling of scientific names so often that I felt like I was in a woodland spelling bee. The dean would be proud. For 3 days, I checked the species and ecosystems off the list to justify the trip. We mapped vegetation, soils, and temperature with the fervor of Alexander von Humboldt. At night, we drew graphs around the campfire. Oak hickory at mid-elevation, coarse gravelly soil, check. Reduced stature and increased wind speed at high elevation, check. Phenological patterns with elevational change, check. Endemic salamanders, niche diversification, check. I so wanted them to see the world beyond the boundaries of their own skins. I was conscientious not to waste a single teaching opportunity and filled the quiet woods with facts and figures. My jaw ached at the end of the day when I crawled into my sleeping bag. This was hard work. When I hike, I like to do it quietly, just looking, just being there. Here I was constantly talking, pointing things out, generating discussion questions in my head, being the teacher. I only lost it once. The road became steeper as we approached the top of the range. The vans labored around sharp switchbacks and were buffeted by strong winds. No more soft maples and pink froth of redbud. At this elevation, the snows had only recently melted away from beneath the firs. Looking out over the land, we could see how narrow this band of boreal forest was, a thin strip of Canadian habitat way down here in North Carolina, hundreds of miles north from the nearest spruce fir woods, just a remnant from the day when ice covered the north. Today, these high mountaintops offer a refuge that feels like home to spruce and fir, islands in a sea of southern hardwoods, perched high enough to duplicate the Canadian climate. These islands of northern woods felt like home to me, too, and in the fresh, cold air, I slipped the leash of my lectures. We prowled among the trees, breathing in the scent of balsam, the soft mattress of needles, wintergreen, trailing arbutus, bunchberry, all my familiars from home carpeted the forest floor. They made me realize suddenly how displaced I felt to be teaching in someone else's home forest when I was so far from my own. I lay down on a carpet of moss and held class from a spider's perspective. High on these summits live the world's last populations of the endangered spruce fir moss spider. I didn't expect pre-med students to give a damn, but I had to speak up for the spiders. They have persisted here since the glaciers picked up and left, living their tiny lives spinning webs among mossy rocks. Global warming is the major threat to this habitat and these animals. As the climate warms, this island of boreal forest will melt away, and with it the last of many lives, never to return. Already insects and disease from warmer elevations are claiming them. When you live on the summit, there's no place to go when the hot air rises. They will balloon away on strands of spider silk, but there will be no refuge. I ran my hand over a mossy rock, thinking of the unraveling of ecosystems and the hand that pulls the loose thread. We have no right to take their homes from them, I thought. Maybe I spoke out loud or had a zealot's look in my eye because one student suddenly asked, "Is this like your religion or something?" Ever since a student had challenged my teaching of evolution, I'd learned to tread lightly on these matters. I felt all of their eyes upon me, good Christians, every one. So I hemmed and hawed about loving the woods, started to explain about indigenous environmental philosophies and kinship with the other members of creation, but they looked at me so quizzically that I stopped and then hastened off to point out a nearby clump of sporulating ferns. At that time in my life, in that setting, I felt that I couldn't explain the ecology of spirit, a sense that went so far from Christianity and science alike that I was sure they wouldn't understand. And besides, we were there for science. I should have just answered yes. After many miles and many lectures, at last it was Sunday afternoon. Job done, mountains climbed, data collected. My pre-med students were dirty and tired, their notebooks filled with more than 150 non-human species and the mechanisms behind their distributions. I'd have a good report for the dean. We hiked back to the vans in the late golden light, through a stand filled with the pendant blooms of mountain silverbell that seemed to glow from within like pearly lanterns. The students were awfully quiet, tired, I imagined. With mission accomplished, I was happy just to watch the slant of hazy light over the mountains for which this park is justly famous. A hermit thrush sang from the shadows, and a little breeze brought a shower of white petals around us as we walked in that amazing place. I was suddenly so sad. I'm tempted to say I'm sorry, but I'm not. In that moment, I knew that I had failed. I thought this wouldn't happen because I've read this before, but it happened before and it's going to happen again. I had failed to teach the kind of science that I had longed for as a young student. Seeking the secret of asters and goldenrod, a science deeper than data. Can you read this, Becky? So it's here. I just can't read it without weeping.
I had given them so much information, all the patterns and processes laid on so thick as to obscure the most important truth. I missed my chance, leading them down every path save the one that matters most. How will people ever care for the fate of moss spiders if we don't teach students to recognize and respond to the world as gift? I told them all about how it works and nothing of what it meant. We may as well have stayed home and read about the Smokies. In effect, against all my prejudices, I'd worn a white lab coat into the wilderness. Betrayal is a heavy load, and I plodded along, suddenly weary. I turned to see the students coming down the trail behind me, a petal-strewn path in gauzy light. One person, I don't know who, began to sing, ever so quietly, those familiar first notes, the ones that open your throat, irresistibly calling you to sing, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." One by one they joined in, singing in the long shadows and a drift of white petals settling onto our shoulders. That saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was humbled. Their singing said everything that my well-intentioned lectures did not. On and on they went, adding harmonies as they walked. They understood harmony in a way that I did not. I heard in their raised voices the same outpouring of love and gratitude for the creation that Sky Woman first sang on the back of Turtle Island. In their caress of that old hymn, I came to know that it wasn't naming the source of wonder that mattered. It was wonder itself. Despite my manic efforts and my checklist of scientific names, I knew now that they hadn't missed it all. Was blind, but now I see. And they did, and so did I. If I forget every genus and species I ever knew, I'll never forget that moment. The worst teacher in the world or the best teacher in the world, neither can be heard over the voices of silverbells and hermit thrushes. The rush of waterfalls and the silence of mosses have the last word. As an enthusiastic young PhD, colonized by the arrogance of science, I had been fooling myself that I was the only teacher. The land is the real teacher. All we need as students is mindfulness. Paying attention is a form of reciprocity with the living world. receiving the gifts with open eyes and open heart. My job was just to lead them into the presence and ready them to hear. On that smoky afternoon, the mountains taught the students, and the students taught the teacher. As I drove home that night, the students slept or studied by dimming flashlight. That Sunday afternoon changed forever my way of teaching. A teacher comes, they say, when you are ready. And if you ignore its presence, it will speak to you more loudly. But you have to be quiet to hear. So now we're just going to prepare ourselves to take from today what you've got, put it in your pocket, keep it warm, think about it, and we'll hear some beautiful music from Carol.